Welcome again. Welcome to this second webinar of the series of webinars on global learning on democratic innovation, where we will be sharing international experience on democratic innovation that we hope will inspire American democratic renewal. This is a series that is being co-hosted by the Club of Madrid and Public Agenda. My name is María, Elena, Agüero. I'm the Secretary General of the Club of Madrid, and I'll be moderating this webinar today, but also doing a lot of listening because I think that the topic is of particular interest today in light of the tensions that we see around the topic of immigration or around the reality of immigration. This is a collaborative effort between two organizations that are working intensely on democratic strengthening, on democratic renewal, because democracy is ailing everywhere in both transitional and mature democracies. And from a democratic perspective, we are both working and contributing, hopefully, to democratic development. But before going into further detail on the webinar series and on our organizations, let me please welcome and briefly introduce and sincerely thank our panelists, about whom I'll be sharing a little bit more information later on. But let me please introduce them first. Laura Chinchilla, former president of Costa Rica from 2010 to 2014, a member of the Club de Madrid and a vice president of the club, and one of the two vice presidents of the Club de Madrid. And she will be giving us an initial take on the subject with her views on immigration and social cohesion in Latin America. We also have Dr. Saunders, who is a Canadian-British citizen and journalist and an author of various books on these topics. And he is the International Affairs columnist at the Globe and Mail, and currently a resident fellow or a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy. He will be addressing the changing public perceptions on immigration from threat to opportunity. And Rachel Peric, who's executive director of Welcoming America, and is the American respondent, let's say, in this webinar and in this discussion, and she'll be reflecting on the transferability of international experiences to the US context, based on her experience of creating welcoming communities where immigrants and refugees thrive and belong. And last but not least, let me just share a bit of why I am particularly interested and keen in this discussion. And it is because I too am a migrant. I'm a Cuban refugee, a Cuban American citizen. And for family reasons, I feel like I'm the perennial migrant. So I'm not an expert, but I'm a practitioner on migration and very, very interested in what we're going to be listening to today. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for participating, and thank you especially to the panelists. As I was saying earlier, this is the second in a series of 4 webinars where we will be exploring how we can make democracy work in new and better ways and respond to a series of challenges that are undermining trust and driving tensions worldwide around this topic, not only in the US, but we see it in many, many countries. The webinars will be bringing examples of democratic leadership and innovation from around the world to American democracy reformers, to American democracy practitioners, to thought leaders, to policymakers and civil society organizations. Public Agenda's Yankelevich Democracy Monitor noted that American citizens respond enthusiastically to new democratic practices and reforms. Interest in democratic innovations that have emerged in other countries is growing among American scholars and American reformers, among other things, because of the challenges being felt in the country's own democratic practice and democratic development, and the sense of growing polarization, political, social, and economic polarization. In this context, it is the Public Agenda and the Club of Madrid decided to join forces and organize this series of discussions and international webinars, given today's pandemic conditions. They are webinars, and this are all aimed at bringing to the American democracy practitioners and stakeholders examples of approaches that have helped build bridges, mend gaps of social division, and strengthen democracy in other countries. Each of the webinars will be focusing on a different theme. Last week, which was the first one, was on building bridges in divided societies, and we discussed possible solutions to the tensions generated by political polarization. The second webinar, which is this one, will focus on immigration and social cohesion and bring in these examples of successful approaches from other countries to American practitioners. Now, the Club of Madrid, let me tell you a little bit about the two organizations. Club of Madrid is an organization that brings together over 116 to be more exact, democratic former presidents and prime ministers from over 70 countries. We are an independent, nonpartisan organization, and the glue that brings us together is democracy. That is the ideology that our members share, and our members leverage their leadership experience, their hands-on experience to strengthen democratic values and democratic practice around the world. They don't represent their countries, they represent themselves and their experience. This particular initiative, this webinar series, is one of the many activities that we organize under our Shared Societies project, which is funded by the Alan B. Slifka Foundation. It is a project that aims to promote democratic societies, democratic shared societies, which we define as those in which all individuals are equally contributing participants, free to express their differences while integrating their voices within the broader scope of society, within the broader population. Shared societies respect everyone's dignity and human rights, while providing every individual with equal opportunity to engage in policy development, implementation, and monitoring. Club de Madrid has been promoting shared societies, this shared societies concept and approach for over 14 years now, in partnership with the Alan B. Slifka Foundation. And through this initiative, through this project, which has become one of the strategic pillars of our work, we provide leaders around the world with greater and better understanding of the benefits and means to advance social inclusion as an essential element in development. Public Agenda, on the other hand, our partner for this webinar, is a New York-based nonpartisan research and community engagement organization that is also committed to democratic development, to strengthening democracy, and to rebuilding the relationship between citizens and governments. This through community engagement and broadening this and bringing this as an expanding opportunity for all Americans. Public Agenda lifts and amplifies the views of the public to today's, and brings it to today's policy debates and policy makers, and including those of groups that have little voice in public discussions, in public conversations and decision making. Public Agenda also puts in place initiatives to help communities think through tough problems and challenges and build common ground. It aims to help redesign and revitalize American democracy in order to make it more inclusive, participatory, and effective. And this webinar series in particular will feed into Public Agenda's international project on healthier democracies, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which aims to gather examples of democratic innovation from around the world and share these examples with public officials. We know that factors such as inequality, social inclusion, violent conflict, and climate change are driving people, are drivers of people on the move and bringing peoples across borders all around the world. And local communities everywhere are being transformed by the arrival of immigrants. Part of this transformation is positive, and this is something that historically we have accepted as a fact, that immigration has built nations. This is especially the case in the US and in Canada, and we've seen this as a positive for many, many years. But migration we see, and people on the move, has also become a major challenge and is today seen as a serious challenge. We find that initiatives such as Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals actually, on the one hand, recognize the important contributions that immigrants make to development and in their host communities, but also the reason that the reason that they have, or the the very reason is what I'm trying to say. The very reason that they have to highlight this, the Sustainable Development Goals, is evidence of the fact that it is not always seen as a positive, and that transformation does include dynamics of exclusion, stigma, and tensions between local populations and newcomers, between host communities and newcomers. And all of this, we know, has been exacerbated by COVID-19, by the pandemic. And so meeting the challenges of social cohesion, requiring inclusive approaches to public policy, public discourse, and community engagement is today more important perhaps than ever, because of the tensions, because of the social, political, and economic tensions that migration and people on the move seem to highlight, but also today because of the pandemic. In this session, we will be hearing and listening to international leaders and practitioners on the strategies that have been used and they have been witnessing to build stronger and more cohesive communities with immigration, bringing migrants and migration into the equation. They will first share their thoughts with us, and then I will invite them to reflect on the challenges that are being faced in the US today, and then open the floor for discussions. This is just a brief introduction, but before I go to the speakers, let me inform you that the webinar is being recorded, that all participants are asked to please keep your microphones muted, and to share your questions for our panelists using the Q&A function or the chat box. You're welcome to obviously raise your questions and to tweet about the session using the hashtags, the hashtag Healthier Democracies and the hashtag Shared Societies. Let me first then introduce our speakers and give the floor to Laura Chinchilla Miranda, who is, as I said earlier, a member of the, very valued and respected member of the Club of Madrid, and is our vice president, but she's also a political scientist and the first woman to have served as the president of Costa Rica from 2010 to 2014. During her long and successful political career, she served as Minister of Public Security, Minister of Justice, President of the National Immigration Board, and of the National Drug Council. She's also chair of the Congressional Committee on Legal Affairs and Narcotics. From her position in public service, she promoted various policies on citizen security, drug trafficking and organized crime, women's rights, and environmental sustainability. She's also promoted institutional and political reforms throughout Latin America through her work with various international, governmental and non-governmental, national and international organizations. And so let me ask President Chinchilla to launch this discussion, to kick it off with her views and ideas and her own experience on immigration and social cohesion in her country, Costa Rica, but also in Latin America. So welcome, President Chinchilla. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, María Elena, for your kind introduction and presentation. For me, it is a pleasure to be here with Doc and Rachel on behalf of the Club de Madrid to discuss strategies to foster cohesion in relation to immigration. As María Elena said, we have been promoting for nearly 15 years the concept of shared societies. And we define shared societies as one in which all individuals have common sense of belonging and responsibility. The aspiration to build shared societies relates closely to the topic we are discussing today, since social exclusion is a driving cause of migration. Poverty, unemployment, inequalities, together with insecurity and violence, are among the main reasons why people choose to leave their country of origin. By the same token, the aspiration to build shared societies must also guide the response to migration in destination countries. as immigrants settle in communities, in local communities, a particular effort must be made to make sure that all individuals in these communities, immigrants and non-immigrants, have a common sense of belonging and responsibility. This is key to social cohesion. Now, migration is an important issue in the Western Hemisphere. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we have about 40 million people who live outside their country of origin. The largest groups of migrants in this region right now are the following, and I want to give this data because I think it is important to contextualize the topic in Latin America. The first important group are the Venezuelans. This is the largest diaspora in the history of our hemisphere. The political and humanitarian crisis has pushed about 5 million people to emigrate. 85% went to other countries in the neighborhood, especially Colombia. The second are the Central Americans from the so-called Northern Triangle, which includes Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Poverty, insecurity, and the devastating consequences of climate change are pushing an estimated number of 265,000 people to leave these countries every year. And while most of them aspire to go to the United States at their final destination, about 80% don't make it. They are arrested and returned to the countries of origin, or their journey is stopped somewhere along the way, sometimes dramatically by the gangs and the organized crime. One of the worst phases of migration in the Northern Triangle is the unaccompanied children. And finally, the Haitians and Nicaraguans who flee for economic and political reasons. Haiti and Nicaragua are the poorest countries in Latin America and have suffered historically of corrupt and authoritarian governments. In these cases, most migrants move to the neighboring countries, meaning Costa Rica in the case of Nicaraguans and the Dominican Republic in the case of Haitians. It might be interesting for you to know that those two small middle-income countries, Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic, are home to a large proportion of immigrants. Costa Rica is the country with the highest percentage of immigrants in Latin America, in proportion to its population, with almost 10%, followed by the Dominican Republic with nearly 8%. These figures do not include illegal migrants. However, both nations have managed to deal with this issue for many, many years, avoiding the exacerbation of xenophobia and other counterproductive reaction, which doesn't mean the absence of xenophobia episodes at all. Let me speak a little bit about what they are doing, also adding the Colombia case, which is receiving most of the Venezuela migrants, as I already said. The Costa Rican immigration policy has been based historically from one government to another on a solid commitment to protecting the human rights of immigrants and enhancing their contribution to national development. Public policies are complemented by civil society initiatives striving to build a friendly, constructive, and supportive relationship between migrants and nationals. In the case of the Dominican Republic, that country offers also some good examples of positive narrative building on migration. The National Institute of Migration has been implementing an initiative of journalism and migration, working with media professionals to put forward narratives that are based around the human rights of migrants and the need for social cohesion. Colombia is another exemplary case right now, because there the government decided to grant special protection status to 1.7 million Venezuelan immigrants. That was last February. And that decision was taken amid the crisis originated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is something that has to be praised. None of these countries, and that is also important to say, have received significant amounts of resources from the international cooperation to assist in the attention of the migrant population. When compared with other crises in the world, the contrast is huge. For example, while the Syrian crisis received an average of $500 per migrant, in the case of Venezuela, the average has been around $60 per migrant. Just to finish, none of these societies are free from abuses, discrimination, or xenophobia against migrants. Still, there are conscious effort by governments, leaders, and civil society to prevent these problems from escalating. So in general, I would say that Latin America offers positive examples of a strategy to foster social cohesion between immigrants and local communities with the participation of governments and civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Chinchilla. This is, I really feel that this sets the tone. It, as you say, it contextualizes, it helps us understand where we're coming from. And the example of Latin America, I'd like to mention a couple of things that really strike me. Not only the numbers that you mentioned, and the percentages that you mentioned in the case of Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic, which are really very interesting. But in what you were saying, one of the messages I think is also the fact that migrants migrants don't necessarily want to leave their countries. They're often forced to leave their countries by life, by the situation, be it even by natural disasters. And I think that's also something that's very important to keep in mind. From the human perspective, that the protection of human rights is essential, but also that human feeling that I think is important to keep in mind throughout all of this. And so thank you very much. And Doug, if I may, I'd like to give the floor to you. And as we were saying before, you're going to be telling us about, from your perspective, you're going to be addressing the issue of the changing public perceptions on migration, from threat to opportunity. But I also hope that you will enlighten us with your background and your research on cities, migration, and population, which is also very rich. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Maria, and thank you, Laura Chinchilla, for such a great presentation, and thanks to the Club de Madrid and to Welcoming America for making this possible. I've had the privilege over the last several years to spend a lot of time observing up close how the arrival and inclusion of immigrants and refugees takes place at the neighborhood level in a good number of countries, both in wealthy countries in Europe and North America, and in middle-income countries such as Russia, Turkey, and Mexico. Now, there's a popular myth that some societies are naturally happy with immigration, while other more homogenous places are naturally intolerant. People think of Costa Rica as a place that's naturally receptive to refugees from across the region, as it is today. People think of Canada, one of my homes, for example, as a country of immigrants that's always been happy that way. But this has not always been true. Even during my lifetime in the 1960s, that was not true at all of Canada. It was a very homogenous, colonial-minded place that was not very welcoming. And I've watched it change gradually over the decades as policies have changed. Likewise, over the last 20 years, I've watched Germany change from a country where "we are not a country of immigration" was almost a national slogan, to a place where there's a growing consensus among the public toward welcoming newcomers. And I've seen other countries sadly move in the opposite direction. The United States has seen a complex range of public attitudes that have moved all over the map over the recent decades, which should show us that places can change. So how do you change the public perception and reception of immigrants? How do you cause people to start seeing these newcomers as being fellow citizens, not as outsiders, but as neighbors and colleagues who happen to come from somewhere else? I think the most important answer is you change the perception of the public toward immigrants by changing the reality for immigrants. That is, you have policies that allow them to become ordinary members of the public, that turn them into fellow citizens as quickly and easily as possible. So I'd like to list 5 policy principles that I think are important to building tolerance. I don't think there's any country that does all of these right, and they move back and forth, but it's worth keeping these and similar ones in mind. First, give immigrants and refugees a quick pathway from arrival to inclusion. Ensure that newcomers don't spend very long as immigrants or refugees within your country, that they have a quick and decisive pathway to permanent legal status and then potentially to citizenship. Second, and related, make sure people don't have an ambiguous status for a very long period of time. The most dangerous thing for a country is to have a large population of long-term residents who don't have a pathway to citizenship. And many countries suffer from this problem. Of course, temporary and seasonal immigration has an important place in most economies. But people who live in your country for more than a season or two should have an ability to quickly become citizens, at the very least, out of self-interested reasons, so they will become taxpayers and people who create legal businesses and generate employment. So they're adding to your economy, but also for reasons of tolerance and inclusion and basic humanity. Third, make sure that you're bringing entire families, not lone individuals. There's a temptation for governments to view immigrants as units of labor that are simply shifted from one country to another and plugged into the economy, and family members as being expensive dependents who are to be discouraged. But immigrants and refugees don't start to create real benefits for the economy, and they don't become neighbors and colleagues who are viewed by the public as equals until they are able to settle permanently with their families and set down lasting roots in your country and its economy. That's when they become not that strange person next door and then become your neighbor. It's not generally immigrants who are successful. It's the children of immigrants who are born in your country. Remember that integration means employment and education. There's a tendency in some countries to view integration as a matter of culture and language strictly. But I think that's putting the cart before the horse. When people become integrated in the important sense of the word, it's usually when they've achieved the same level of employment and income and the same number of years of education and the same ability to start a business as all other citizens have on average. Once they are equal economically and educationally, the cultural stuff tends to take care of itself. Their kids become fluent in the language. Their culture is seen by neighbors as an interesting characteristic of them rather than as a threat posed by them. And finally, fifth, pay attention to the neighborhoods where people settle. This is the subject, of course, that I've written about. Newcomers usually have to start off in some place where the housing costs are lower than average, where somebody starting at the bottom can afford to live. An immigrant district, an ethnic district, or as I've called it, an arrival city. These neighborhoods should be stepping stones, not traps. Make sure these parts of your cities are physically and economically connected to the main economy. Make sure they contain educational institutions that are not just up to the average, but above your country's average, so that those neighborhoods will become targets for better off people. Make sure it's possible to start a business and get a decent job if you live in one of these neighborhoods. And make sure there are places for a middle class to take shape within them. A small one-time investment at the community level to remove impediments to newcomers will save your country a fortune in the future, because the short-term problems of arrival and inclusion are easy to solve, but the resulting problems of inequality and ghettoization and social division that result from ignoring those problems are very, very expensive, long-term problems to wrestle with. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much. it's interesting, and I find it very, very useful. I mean, the way you've structured it, because it does point to this or that. I mean, on the one hand, on the short term, on the long term, the idea of well, the permanent legal status and the prolonged ambiguous status. It's a very useful way of looking at a number of these challenges. Now, what I like later on for you and others, also what I think would be very interesting to delve into is what role for government, what role for other citizens, what role for civil society in these 5 areas that you've pointed to, what role for government, be it local or national, because I think that's also a very interesting aspect of this. And if I may, I'd like to pass the floor now to Rachel, who is, let's say, our American respondent, the person that is the executive director of Welcoming America, rather, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that leads a movement of inclusive communities, becoming more prosperous by making everyone feel like they belong, by making everyone feel not like they belong, but making everyone feel they do belong. And inspired by her own family's refugee story, Rachel has been working to create communities where all residents, including the immigrants and the refugees, can thrive and again belong. Before Welcoming America, Rachel served as executive director of the Montgomery Coalition for Adult English Literacy and as a regional director of the United Way of the National Capital Area. Now, it'd be very interesting to listen to you and to link this to what Doug was saying also of how this isn't a static issue. I mean, countries and communities and cities change sometimes in the way they welcome or not immigrants. And so it'd be interesting to hear from you, Rachel, on this. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And really, it's such a pleasure to be with all of you. And I, again, thank Club de Madrid and Public Agenda for hosting this conversation. I feel this sort of weight on my shoulders, really, as the American respondent here, speaking to democracy practitioners in the US. And I suppose injecting maybe a little on brand as an American, some sense of gravity and urgency around these issues, but also I hope a sense of hope. And María Elena, I was just thinking as you were talking about your own refugee family history, about my own, and about this very iconic image that always sits over my shoulder of the Statue of Liberty. And when my grandmother, who came as a refugee, first saw that Statue of Liberty, the first thing that went through her mind was that she could finally be free to be herself, be free from persecution. This was in the late 1940s. But you know, at that time, she was entering into United States that was also pre-civil rights movement, or what we know of as a civil rights movement. So deep in Jim Crow laws, we had just finished putting Japanese Americans in internment camps. And so I think it is both impossible to think about immigration in the American context and in many contexts without recognizing that history. Obviously, the experience of Indigenous people and the genocide of Indigenous people in the United States, because immigrants are entering into that stream of history and into these deep questions all over the world, and particularly here in the United States, precisely about this question of belonging. How do we define what it means to be an American? Is this truly a multiracial society in which each member can belong, regardless of whether they were born here or born elsewhere, regardless of their identity? And I say this to my colleagues who are democracy practitioners, because as we talk about these questions of polarization, how do we move forward from this moment? I see the question of immigration really situated in that bigger question for humanity right now. Who is entitled to these basic human rights? How do we make sure that every person is? And I think we have a special and important role to play, those of us who are working on these questions of immigration. And I see demographic change, the set of things that happen when a community changes, as really being a key inflection point where communities and where societies can either bend toward the norms of democracy or away from the norms of democracy. And we've certainly seen that here in the United States, where some communities, and I think, I mean, Doug, your work with Arrival City was seminal reading for me coming into my role at Welcoming America about a decade ago. Some cities have taken that point of demographic change and really turned it into a moment of deep examination for their community. How can we be a place that is welcoming, not only to those who are newly coming here, but to those who have lived here all their lives? And some have gone in the opposite direction, and that has then become the fodder for really dangerous politics, really dangerous narratives to rise. And so a lot of the work that our members at Welcoming America do every day is really helping to use that choice point to make a different set of decisions as a community, and to really build a kind of infrastructure for social cohesion, for inclusion, again, for many of the things that have been discussed already as vitally important for countries that are destinations for immigrants, to do at a local level to ensure that everyone, inclusive of immigrants and refugees, can participate socially, civically, and economically. And I look forward to sharing a little bit more about what that looks like in detail as we continue this conversation, but I'll say for now that there's really three things that we've seen across communities that are really important in that moment of demographic change. And I call them the three N's: narratives, neighbors, and norms. And narratives is about this really important task of connecting communities across values. In our case, this value of shared belonging, and bringing together leaders to really affirm that those values, the values of inclusion, the things that we connect on at a deep human level, are important. And setting an agenda for the community to really act on those values. And when it comes to immigration and being a welcoming community, there are more than 50 of these plans that have been created in the United States and in other parts of the world. We learned a lot from Germany and the city of Stuttgart and the creation of their pact for integration. And similarly, our colleagues in Australia and New Zealand, have been doing similar things. And I'm sure in Latin America as well. So really creating that shared vision and that shared narrative. And the second is about norms, coming to the policies and the everyday practices that are work that every institution in a community needs to take on to reduce the barriers to participation and ensure that people can participate in every sense of that word. And again, happy to talk more about what that looks like in more detail. And then lastly, this neighbors piece. And I think this is so well embodied in the idea of shared society, but the powerful work of intergroup relations and in overcoming these interpersonal divisions, but also certainly in the United States, deep segregation and many barriers that really prevent people from coming to know each other and trusting and working together as neighbors. And really our work at Welcoming America is just to fuel all of that with our 240 members in the United States, half a dozen partners globally, and just bring every tool and resource and power to communities to get all of that right. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very, very much. And I think your three N's do bring together what we've heard from both President Chinchilla and Doug, because in their own ways and with their experience and their references, they did refer to all three: the narratives, the neighbors, and the norms. And thinking of all of these also in terms of the national level again, and the local level and the community level. There, if I may, and just to sort of start the discussion between you, I'd like to introduce a few questions, but one that I'd like to introduce as a theme or as a sub-theme is what you see, the three of you see, as the role of the diasporas both at the community level, both in terms of the evolution of receptiveness, let's say, or of welcoming, and in terms of the effectiveness of the inclusion process, and where sometimes I feel that there is an exclusion element in different stages of diasporas, or different generations, let's say, of diasporas. But that is a personal experience, I think, more than anything else. But I'm curious to see how the diaspora element, how you see it in your well, in what you've been sharing with us. I don't know who wants to go to the question or to the answer first. Silence.
Let's hear from Rachel first on the U.S. side of that.
Well, I'm pausing because I really wanted to understand the question, but I think in the U.S. context, you know, the diaspora are immigrants and refugees who make up such a vital part of the civil society construction of what belonging means. And I think one of the opportunities that we see in a lot of the communities that we work with is that those diaspora organizations, civil society organizations, are really an untapped source of wisdom and knowledge, not only about issues related to immigrants or immigration, but really to, you know, all policy. And I think COVID actually, and the response to COVID is a really strong case around that. The mutual aid organizations that really formed, and the existence of bridging capital across those different diaspora communities was a huge contributing factor to a robust response for the whole community locally. And so I think one thing we would love to see even more of are those diaspora civil society organizations tapped into even more at every level in local government, you know, in our national response on issues. They are a wellspring of creativity and innovation for our society at every level.
Thank you.
In our case, María Elena, I could use as a good example precisely the role of the Nicaraguan diaspora. They have been trying to implement different kind of programs and initiatives, not only to help the new immigrants to be able, you know, to make the transition from the first days to a more kind of permanent status, and also they have been very useful in promoting this, that I call it positive narrative. And if you allow me to say something else about this, and also some comments on what Doug already said, and it was very well put, how important is public policy in terms of welcoming and trying to integrate the immigrants in a society. The problem is that sometimes there are not probably the best conditions for doing that. For example, in times of crisis. So in times of crisis, it is not only about the policies that we should implement in terms to providing access to employment, health, education, and etc., which I agree with that. That is really, really critical. But the problem is when you are going through times of crisis, when the countries in general and the population, it doesn't matter if they are nationals or immigrants, are suffering the impact of economic and social crisis, like the one we are going through. So in these occasions, leadership plays a very important role, because the political leaders have to understand the consequence of saying something, or the consequence of writing something on Twitter because of social, I mean, of the impact that that will have in the rest of the population against immigration. So I just wanted to say this because the role of leadership, responsible leadership in preventing discrimination, in preventing xenophobia is very critical. And what is interesting about Latin America is that we are not a good example in terms of the populist kind of leadership and demagogue. We have abundance of this kind of leadership, but however, they have not crossed that line. In most of the countries, they have not crossed the line of using migration as a partisan issue. And that is something very important.
Let me talk briefly about diasporas in crisis migration, because that's what Laura's talking about. That's what the United States is having a political debate about right now. And I think we're used to, at this point in history, we're used to talking about diasporas in normal economic, family migration, and recognizing that they're important, that people are assisted by people from the same background where they settle and so on. But when crisis migration happens, when asylum seekers come to the border, when people are forced to flee another country, or part of a large movement of emergency migrants, we tend to forget our lessons about the importance of diaspora communities. And I think the outstanding example of that recently was the response in European countries to the million-odd people who came across the Mediterranean and Turkey in 2015 and 2016. And while I think there were some good responses in a couple countries, even in those countries like Germany and Sweden, there is a tendency for policymakers to respond. And look, you can't really be too critical of them, because any country that's trying to settle 1 million people in a year is doing everything it can. But there was a tendency to say, let's try to settle people where there is empty housing, and let's give a priority to places where there are fewer immigrants, especially immigrants from these same places where they came from. So cities in Germany and Sweden, neighborhoods in Germany and Sweden that had a lot of people from Syria and the Middle East already living in them were discouraged. We said, no, you don't have to take any refugees. Let's settle them in this post-industrial place that has empty apartment buildings. And I think that was a mistake. And fortunately, it didn't work, because the refugees who were able to, after they'd finished their year of living where they were assigned, a lot of them moved to some city with a lot of people from the Middle East living in it, so they could borrow money off a neighbor and open a shop and get their kids into school and all that other stuff. They could work the networks of connections. But there's sort of a misunderstanding that people who are fleeing, who are crisis migrants, are not part of diasporas, or that these networks won't help them because they're refugees. Of course, one thing we need to recognize is that every refugee is also an economic immigrant. That anybody fleeing something is also needs to find work or small business opportunities or something so they can feed their family and some secure living. And not only that, but most regular economic immigrants are to some extent also running away from some situation that's maybe not ideal for them. So the idea that refugees, asylum seekers, and normal economic immigrants are two different groups of people is a bit of a mistake. Often the smartest policy for countries like the United States is to turn refugees into regular economic immigrants, to take them in as labor migrants, because it removes the stigma of refugee status and allows them a more normal entryway, but all along to recognize that they are part of a diaspora. That the community of people from the same background, even if those people didn't come as refugees, can help them a lot more often than governments and other communities can.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Betilde Munoz, who's joined us, has a question. I see her hand up. Hello.
Yes. Hi, María Elena. Very good afternoon to you all. Presidenta, un gusto verla. It's been a great discussion. I really want to commend the Club of Madrid and its partner for provoking this conversation on the connections of migration and democracy. We seldom see this. So that's great. And I loved, Rachel, the use of the 3 N's, the narratives, neighbors, and norms. My question was actually on the issue of narratives, and especially considering that the OAS, the Organization of American States, where I work, along with the Club of Madrid, we are currently working on a project on narratives. And I had a question that President Chinchilla just answered, so she anticipated
Matilda, we lost you.
because I think they changed me as part of the. So
they want to show you, exactly. They want to see you.
Exactly. I only had audio, now I have both. So good to see everyone. So my question was on the issue of narratives, and President Chinchilla just, share with us the importance of responsible leadership. And my question was, from low to high, what would you say is the relevance and the impact of the narratives that political leaders have? So, understanding or basing from President Chinchilla's pertinent response to that, my question would be how best to handle those leaders who actually cross the line and use negative narratives to refer to migration, and also perhaps how can we increase the cost, cómo subirles el costo, no? How to increase the cost of using these narratives. So that was my question for you all.
I have a very easy answer. You have to vote against them.
Yeah, well, that's
democracy.
Well, that is in first hand, but of course you have to do something else. And if you allow me just to say something in addition to what I already said. Certainly press and the media plays also a very important role because it is not only that the leaders will say what they want to say, it is also the way they receive the coverage from the media. It is tempting for the media to fall for the provocative kind of messages, and they try to amplify them. So I think that what we are finding after the experience, for example, in the United States, that there is a growing consciousness among journalists of the important role they can play to change that discourse. For example, it is important to avoid referring to immigration in the context of criminality and delinquency, something very common, sometimes just because they don't know. I think that we have to invest in training. When I work in government, we organize different training sessions with the journalists to provide them the figures about, the proportion of people incarcerated in Costa Rica. I mean, foreigners, the representation was really, really low. No. So this kind of, training, providing the right data is also very important for the press to understand that they play a critical role in changing the narrative concerning migration.
Thank you. Sorry, Rachel, go ahead, please.
I would just love to add to that by adding a star to everything that President Chinchilla has said. And also, I think, when we think about this question of who is seen and respected as a leader, in addition to our elected leaders, our faith leaders, our business leaders, others in the community that are well regarded, play an essential role here. And and I think that there need to be strategies to both boundary the bad, so some in-group policing, within those groups to identify what is out of bounds, but also some incentives to do the right thing. And I think this is an area that we've certainly explored in our own work. How do we encourage good behaviors by giving people the tools and the capacities, but also bringing some positive incentives to the work? That was one of the reasons we created a certification program here in the United States. Many of our global partners are doing the same thing to help communities identify as welcoming places and really use that as a seal to promote themselves for trade and tourism and investment. We know that people want to go to places, people want to do business in places that are welcoming. So how can we continue to create those incentives around that, not just here at Welcoming America, but amongst all of us?
Mm-hmm. Doug, as a journalist, what would you say on this one as well?
Well, I agree very much with President Chinchilla's view that there are important lessons in the types of messages that are sent out. But I would also add that on the receiving end, we need to recognize that those messages reach people. When I started out talking about how countries change, what's interesting about immigration is it's one of those areas where people change their views during their lifetimes, right? There are other policy issues, there are other attitudes where you really have to wait a generation for attitudes to change. You have to think, okay, there's a new generation emerging who will be more tolerant in this area or something. On immigration and people who've come as immigrants who are maybe of different skin color or religion, people from the majority community can and do change their views very quickly because of lived experience. And lived experience includes media messages. I wish I could attribute us more power than we have, but that's part of it. But certainly creating lived experience. There's a type of public opinion polling that they liked to do in Britain, where they first ask somebody the general question, then ask them specific. So they'll say, how do you think the economy is going? And then they'll say, you personally, how's your bank balance looking in the last year? But importantly, they would say, what do you think about immigration from outside Europe to citizens? And then they'd say, how do you personally feel about the people of immigration background who live on your street or work in your workplace or go to your school? And it was interesting, the gap, because the people who said, immigration's terrible, it's ruining the country, and these people are taking over and this sort of thing, were very often people who'd say, oh, but Mohammed down the street, he's just the greatest guy. You know, I love Layla, my colleague, and that sort of thing. So there's something to be said for drawing the dotted line between the lived experience of people and the larger policy things, to recognize that when we're talking about refugees or immigration policy, we're not talking about some random figure that we see on the TV news hanging out outside the shopping mall and smoking a cigarette or something like that, that we're talking about these people around you who you already know. Maybe we're talking about people in your own family. It's worth the historical reminder to remind people that the good immigrants, the people who are now trusted, like the Italians in the United States and so on, are people who were distrusted as civilizational threats not very long ago. As recently as the 1950s, there were best-selling books in the United States saying Southern European Catholics are a civilizational threat to the very being of the United States. And if we're not careful, by 1961, one of them will be a president or something, you know. And so it's worth reminding people that this happens over and over again. This is nothing new. We distrust people when they're new, then their kids get into university and they're just our normal neighbors.
Now, if we look at what we've just been discussing and the role of leadership, the role of the media, and how these things can also change, and sometimes change on the topic of immigration is faster than one can think. There is this issue that I'd like to ask Rachel about, of let's call it the trickle up rather than the trickle down. How can experiences at the community level trickle up and generate change at the level of policy making? What is your experience there? It's a question to all of you, but obviously because of the role that Welcoming America plays and the jobs the work that you do, how do you see that?
Well, I think this picks up perfectly on what Doug just finished saying about people experiencing difference through their neighbors, and it's that visceral connection that can only be made at a community level that influences the narrative and then trickles from the bottom up. But it is also true, certainly I'll just speak for the US, that many social change issues have worked their way from the bottom up. Smoking cessation being an example of that, marriage equality being an example of that. And so, I think if we do get to a tipping point, it will come because we're able to show that this is, this is the inevitable desire of communities. And I think there also needs to be mechanisms in place. And one of the things that the United States doesn't have right now, and we're hoping that the Biden administration will reinvigorate, that was established under the Obama administration, was the Task Force for New Americans. And we hope an Office of New Americans that can really orchestrate and fuel the kind of infrastructure that's needed at a community level, while also listening to the perspectives that come from the communities that have been wrestling through this, and I think can offer a lot to inform federal policy around immigration.
If I can add one thing on the political point, I think we tend to frame this as a matter of liberals who are tolerant toward immigration and conservatives who aren't, and I think that's a mistake. I think some of the biggest change happens when the party that is viewed as the major conservative party in a country decides that it's in its best interests to become a party of tolerance and diversity. And this happens more often than not. It has happened to an important degree in Canada during the 2000s, in Britain during David Cameron's time, in Germany under Angela Merkel, and even in the United States, I would say the Republican Party, up until 2015, was making a big effort to recognize that it did not have a future unless it became a party that Americans of Latin American immigrant descent especially were willing to vote for. And party leaders who've done this have recognized we can be conservative. Immigrants are people who are more religious than the average population, so they tend to be social conservatives. They're people who are very likely to be small business people, so they're economic conservatives. The only reason why they're not voting for our party is because there's some racists in our party. And if we can get them out or make them shut up, then we can become a party of diversity, just like the more liberal parties are. And you want to welcome that, even if you're not of that ideological persuasion. You want to be in a country where the left-wing and right-wing parties are both competing to be the parties of inclusion and tolerance rather than opposite. It's sad to see that France and the United States are countries where the conservative parties took a turn away from wanting to be big tent parties of inclusion. But it's worth struggling to help people who are far outside of your own ideological worldview to move in a direction where they want to welcome people as well.
In a way, Doug, I'd say that what I saw, what I heard in the case of the last election in the U.S., maybe not enough in my view, but you found that Latin American immigrants were and diasporas who had been traditionally Republican were voting Democratic for some of the same reasons that you've just pointed to, because they just could not accept that rejection that was coming from the Republican side. And as I say, it wasn't maybe enough to change things dramatically, but the change was there. Let me ask. I think we're going to have to get final statements from you, but let me ask just one last question that links up with what you were all saying now, and this is perhaps from the economic and demographic perspective. In the case of Canada, Doug, in your book, and here I thank Veronique because I have not read the book, but she pointed this out to me. In your book, you argue that Canada needs to triple its population in order to meet its economic, social, and environmental objectives in the future. Now, this is a very real issue also in Europe. It is a real issue in many other countries. The fact that immigrants on the one hand may be rejected or not understood, immigration not understood, but the fact of the matter is that immigrants are needed in order to change the demographics and for social, political, and economic reasons. So how do you see this? And this has to do with leadership and with a narrative, and this has to do with the welcome, and it has to do with everything that we've been discussing. So I'd love to hear your take on this.
Well, I certainly don't think there are a lot of other countries that want to be discussing large-scale population growth as a solution per se, but there's an important lesson in what I was saying in the book Maximum Canada. I mean, I think Canada and maybe Australia and New Zealand are among the only countries in the world that could be said to have an underpopulation problem. But really the message of that book, which does apply to a lot of other countries, was Canada tripled its population between 1945 and 2015, and it never expected to. If you listen to the debates in the 40s and 50s, people thought the population might increase by 10% or something like that. But it tripled almost entirely because of immigration, and it made the country a much better place, much more socially coherent, much more integrated, much more economically and culturally successful and influential. But it was done by accident and often by catch-up. You know, 1965, suddenly all the provincial premiers realized we don't have anywhere near enough schools. Let's build 10,000 schools. It's the reason why every high school in Canada looks exactly the same as every other, because they were all built in a panic in the same year. But we need to recognize that you need to be planning for the immigration arrival that's going to happen, not for the immigration levels and population growth that you want to happen. If your country is seeing its birth rate lower, which most countries are, I mean, even, you know, Turkey is below France's level, Bangladesh, Iran are countries that are seeing their population growth rates approach negative. China this week announced for the first time in modern history that its population is not growing, it's declining. China will become, within a generation, a country of immigration as a result of that, whether it acknowledges it or not, because as long as its economy is doing okay, it will need people and they will come. Nature abhors a vacuum. As long as your country is not an economic failure, it is going to be bringing people in. So we need to be doing our planning for infrastructure investment, for urban planning, for neighborhood growth, for transportation planning, with an honest understanding of where people are going to be settling. We've seen smart examples, for example, in Colombia, for example, of city governments that have said, okay, we should acknowledge that we're going to have 100,000 extra people, maybe coming from Venezuela, maybe this sort of thing, living in our city. Let's build some service lots with plumbing and electricity in some areas near the center of the city that are underutilized, where people can build their own houses because they're going to be coming there. That's smart planning, because it's much harder to turn a slum that has developed because people came in when you weren't expecting them and built their own houses. It's much harder to normalize a slum like that and turn it into a stable place later than it is to put in the electricity and services and recognize it as a legitimate legal community in advance of people arriving. So that's the lesson from that, is plan for what's going to happen, not what you'd like to happen.
María Elena, you are muted.
Thank you. Yes, I know. Thank you very much. It's just my fingers isn't fast enough. Thank you very much. Time is almost up, but I do want to, number one, thank you, but give the other two a chance for a last message, if you have one, and Doug as well, obviously. But if there's anything that you would like to say as a final message. This has been fascinating, and I could go on and on. I have a million questions to ask all of you, so I hope there is a repeat of this one. If there are no, I don't know if there are any comments, or we should just.
I just say something very fast, just as a conclusion. But in general, I think that that we agree that the challenge of fostering social cohesion is enormous and requires the engagement of many segments of society when it comes to the immigration policies, political leaders, policymakers, journalists, and of course, civil society. And it also needs a coordinated global approach. So I just want to close, making a, asking for a commitment for the rest of the countries to support the global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. We feel, we feel very hopeful about the way the Biden administration is approaching to these issues in a human way, and also respecting the international treaties and so on. We also hope that the new administration will decide to join this important agreement as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for mentioning that, President Chinchilla.
And maybe I'll just end by saying Welcoming America was a signatory along with a number of our members last week on a letter that was organized by the Mayor's Migration Council and signed on to by a number of organizations responding to an executive order that that President Biden issued early in his term around climate migration. And I think if we think about these two dual issues of climate and migration as being deeply intertwined, and obviously having a critical local response to play, particularly around the issues that were just brought up around planning and forethought. We can plan for and be more resilient to climate change. We can also plan for and be more resilient to demographic change. And cities and communities have an enormous role to play in that, as we see 25 million to 1 billion more people on the move. And so preparing them now, galvanizing them now, coordinating them now to take that action and that forethought is just critically important. And I'm just so grateful for this global conversation, because I think it is that level of organization and cooperation that's really needed in this moment. So thank you.
Thank you all very much. And I think that an important aspect of all of this is to realize that, yes, there's a lot of change there. There's a lot to be done. There's still a lot to be done, but awareness is greater today of the challenges, and therefore the possibility of global compact being an example of something that is there, and that probably wouldn't have been there if some of these issues hadn't come up, with some of these challenges hadn't been so grave, referring to the gravity and the urgency that was mentioned earlier. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the participants and the attendees, and share with you that the next webinar in this series will be next Thursday, and it will focus on racial wounds and promoting racial justice, healing racial wounds and promoting racial justice. We hope that you will join us, and if you cannot join us then live, it will be recorded, so you will all be able to listen to it and use it, which is use the messages, which is what this is all about, the messaging and the narrative. Thank you very much to all of you.
Goodbye.
Thank you to the team. Thank you, President Chinchilla, Doug, and Rachel. It was a pleasure. Take good care.